The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
All the things that happened back then, we have to remember them. It's important.
The international community learned its lessons from the war of annihilation and genocide and introduced rules. The fascination with authoritarianism and populist temptations is gaining ground again in Europe.
We have to hope things will get better and that people will be smart enough not to repeat the horrors of the past.
To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin the day with Germany's unconditional surrender in World War II. It came into force on May 8, 1945, ending the war here in Europe. The Nazi reign of terror was over, but the specter of that dictatorship, it still hangs over Europe 80 years later.
Beginning of May 1945.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hailed the end of the war in Europe.
The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
Jubilation in London, Paris, Washington, and Moscow. Germany is defeated and lies in ruins. The 12-year Nazi reign of terror, which plunged the world into the abyss, is now history. 6 years of war had resulted in at least 60 million, mostly civilian deaths. 6 million European Jews were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. On May 7, 1945, Colonel General Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of the German Wehrmacht. It came into force at 11 p.m. on the 8th of May. Hitler committed suicide a few days earlier, thus evading, like many other top Nazis, being held to account. In defeated Germany, destruction and hunger reigned. The infrastructure was almost completely destroyed. Whole residential areas razed to the ground. This was the legacy of Nazi rule. The victorious Allied powers, the US, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, divided Germany into 4 occupation zones and Berlin into 4 sectors. They all saw a need to demilitarize and denazify the country. In practice, however, the occupying powers proceeded very differently. In the years that followed, differences between the Allies deepened, and the Cold War loomed. In 1949, Germany was officially divided into 2 states, the German Democratic Republic in the east and the Federal Republic in the west. The first free elections in West Germany took place in August 1949. Moscow responded swiftly. In the east, Stalin erected a state based on the Soviet model. Communist East Germany is officially founded in October 1949. Germany remained divided until the fall of the Berlin Wall, with people in West and East Germany living in completely different political, social, and economic systems for 4 decades.
Well, after the war, Germany was forced to confront the crimes of the Nazi era. Initially, that process was led by the Allies, but later it was carried out from within German society. Today, Holocaust denial and Nazi symbols are outlawed across the country. And for decades, far-right parties were kept out of the German parliament. But that has changed in recent years with the rise of the far-right Alternative for Germany party. The AfD, as it's known, is now the second biggest party in the German parliament, winning almost 21% of the vote in February's national election. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier had a clear message about the lessons of the past as he gave a speech to mark today's anniversary.
We look at our country, in which extremist forces are gaining strength, in which the institutions of democracy are being mocked, including those who represent them, where debates have become toxic, toying with people's concerns, exploiting fear, and pitting people against each other. In this way, old evil spirits have been brought back to life.
And to speak more now about how Germany has dealt with its Nazi past, I'm joined by Mary Fulbrook, professor of German history at University College London. She is currently on the campus of Harvard University in the United States. Professor, it's good to have you with us tonight. After World War II, the Allied powers decided to implement a process known as denazification. What were the main goals there?
Okay, well, it depended whether you were in East or West Germany, what the main goals were. Basically, the idea was to rid Germany both of Nazis in high places and to rid Germans of Nazi ideas and ideology. So to re-educate as well as to change the structures of society. And this was very different depending on how you understood it. In West Germany, the focus was really on re-education. A lot of personnel stayed in the same positions. In East Germany, it was very much more changing the structures of power, changing the political and social and economic structures, and getting Nazis out of places of influence and power.
What measures were put into place to identify Nazis and to remove them from those positions of power? I mean, you weren't just trying to read minds here, right? I mean, you were looking at someone's CV as well.
Yeah. In the Western zones, there was this incredibly cumbersome notion of a questionnaire, a Fragebogen, and that prompted people going through the process in the West to really rewrite their own stories, to produce what were commonly laughed at as personal certificates, washing brown shirts white. You went in wearing a brown shirt, you came out wearing a white shirt. So you whitewashed your past, you presented yourself in a new light. In East Germany, it was a lot more draconian, also questionnaires, but they didn't take much notice of attempts to dress up the past. And in East Germany, it was very much more a question of getting rid of people who held significant political positions, who were teachers, who were educators, who were in the legal profession, who were journalists. Anyone who was in a position to influence minds and people was booted out in favor of young, untainted, new teachers, for example, or people who were committed to the communist cause. So it's very much more a radical restructuring in East Germany than it was in the West, where jokes have been made about really it was just getting rid of the taint of Nazism from former Nazis.
So when we take all of that into consideration, how successful would you say, how successful was denazification?
Well, how successful depends on what your criteria of success are. And that was very different in East and West. And even adopting the criteria, it's difficult to answer that one simply. So let me just put it very, very bluntly. In East Germany, I think it was remarkably successful in the sense that the communists gained and retained power. They inserted their people into top positions and kept them there despite wobbles, 1953 uprising, other wobbles. East Germany was one of the most stable communist dictatorships in the Eastern Bloc, and it was not least due to the radical transformation of politics, society, and the economy in the early post-war years. So in that sense, you could say denazification in the East was sort of a success, with some interesting ambiguities, like former Nazis who became very good communists were not from their places. In West Germany, I think it's also an incredibly complicated answer that I have to give you as simply as I can. West Germans, even to the mid-1950s, a majority of West Germans said yes to things like Hitler was one of the greatest German statesmen ever, or would have been if Germany had lost the war. So still supporting Hitler. And I think when you ask about how was West German democracy so stable, there are two answers. One is they rehabilitated and reintegrated former Nazis, including in very high places. So in that sense, you could say denazification was not happening at the top. And the second is democracy really stabilized because of the economic miracle. So as West Germany became more prosperous, so more people began to say, yes, democracy is a good idea in principle. So it was the economic miracle and the rehabilitation and reintegration of former Nazis that stabilised West German democracy, not denazification in any simple sense.
Fascinating. I want to ask you, too, before we run out of time, about memory culture. Memory culture has been a key part of Germany confronting its Nazi legacy. I mean, how did that emerge? I mean, it reminds me of this book I read in the 1990s by Jane Kramer, the Politics of Memory. I mean, but how is this memory culture connected to denazification?
Okay, so for a very long time in West Germany, the Nazi past was not adequately confronted. And it took some outlying people, Fritz Bauer, the attorney in the Land of Hessen, who was a Jew, a socialist, had to flee Germany during the Third Reich. He was the one who was determined to bring Auschwitz to trial, for example, against a huge amount of opposition. I think the memory culture in West Germany really started to emerge in the late 70s, 1980s, and was very different from in East Germany, which was under Marxist auspices, the anti-fascist state, a quite different view of the Nazi past. What you've got since unification, 1990, German unification, from then on, you've got this explosion of memorialization of victims, massive memorialization of the Jews, but also a range of other groups, Sinti and Roma, very belatedly, homosexual victims of Nazi persecution, very belatedly, and others, victims of forced sterilization and euthanasia, and so on. So you've got this huge memorial culture of victims, but I think, again, it's a more complicated answer than you might think, because memorialization of victims is an indication of remorse on the part of the second and third generation. But at the same time, there's been a failure to confront complicity, widespread complicity in the system that made this persecution possible. So I think it's a very one-sided picture. It's not a complete answer to dealing with the German past.
Professor Fulbrook, unfortunately we're out of time, but fascinating discussion with you. And this discussion just shows how complex and how complicated memory and denazification, all of these subjects are, even 80 years afterwards. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.